In the 18th of June 76, 262 men of the 7th Cavalry perished at the Little Bighorn, nearly half the regiment in a single day. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, their war paint vivid, swept through the valley, outnumbering Major Marcus Reno's 150 troopers 10-1. Reno, his uniform dust-streaked, climbed a bluff, pleading with Captain Frederick Benteen, who clutched his saber, for rescue. As native lances gleamed, why did Benteen's choices save some but doom others? Watch to uncover the decisions that defined this tragic clash. Captain Frederick Benteen, his grey coat unbuttoned and flapping in the June heat, led 3 companies of the 7th Cavalry, totaling about 120 men, back to the main trail along Reno Creek on the 25th of June, 1876. His horse, a sturdy bay, kicked up clouds of dust as the column moved, weary from a scout that had stretched over 10 miles across rugged Montana terrain. Benteen, a seasoned officer with 15 years in the cavalry, had just completed a fruitless search for signs of native villages to the south, as ordered by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. Historian John Gray notes that Benteen's scout, though thorough, yielded no trace of the Sioux or Cheyenne, raising questions about Custer's vague instructions. The captain's face, weathered and stern, betrayed frustration as he rejoined the trail, aware that his detachment was now far from the main force. His decision to press forward, however, set the stage for the critical hours ahead. A mile to the east, the pack train lumbered along, its 140 mules laden with ammunition boxes and canvas sacks, each carrying up to 200 pounds of supplies. Led by Captain Thomas McDougall, the train moved at a plodding pace, no faster than 2 miles per hour, as recorded in Army logistics reports. The mules, stubborn and burdened, struggled over uneven ground, their handlers cursing under the midday sun. This vital lifeline carried 24,000 rounds of 45 to 70 Springfield carbine ammunition, essential for the 7th Cavalry's survival in any prolonged fight. Yet, its slow progress, as historian Robert Utley observes, created a dangerous gap between Benteen's fighting force and the supplies needed to face the massive native coalition ahead. The pack train's lag would soon force Benteen into a tactical dilemma, highlighting the Army's underestimation of the Sioux and Cheyenne's strength. Benteen halted his column at a marshy patch known as the Morass, a shallow depression where Reno Creek's waters pooled. His men, numbering 120 troopers plus officers, dismounted, loosening saddles and leading horses to drink. The stop, lasting 15 to 20 minutes according to survivor accounts, allowed soldiers to refill canteens and rest after hours in the saddle. Benteen, standing with hands on hips, surveyed the scene, his kepi shielding his eyes from the sun. The pause was standard cavalry practice, as horses needed water to maintain stamina for a march that had already covered 30 miles since dawn. However, historian Gregory Michno argues that this halt, while necessary, cost Benteen precious time, as Custer's main force was already engaging the enemy 12 miles ahead. The morass, a fleeting moment of calm, would later fuel debates over Benteen's priorities in the face of an unfolding crisis. Critics, notably historian Robert Utley, have long scrutinized Benteen's linger at the morass, claiming it delayed aid to Custer's beleaguered command. Utley estimates that the 15 to 20-minute pause, combined with Benteen's earlier scout, put his column nearly an hour behind Custer's advance. This delay, Utley contends, reflected Benteen's cautious approach, shaped by his strained relationship with Custer, whom he openly disliked. Benteen's defenders, however, argue that his men and horses, exhausted after marching 40 miles in 24 hours, needed the rest to remain combat-ready. Soldier diaries, such as those of Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, confirm the troops were parched and fatigued, with some horses showing signs of lameness. The controversy over the Morass stop reveals a deeper tension: Benteen's adherence to protocol versus the urgent, chaotic demands of the battlefield, where over 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors awaited. Captain Thomas Weir, commanding D Company, paced restlessly at the morass, his polished spurs glinting as he adjusted his gauntlets. At 35, Weir was a bold officer, known for his impatience with indecision. Sensing the halt dragged on, he approached Lieutenant William Godfrey, his voice sharp, urging him to prod Benteen into action. Weir's 40-man company, mounted on fresh horses, had led the column's advance, and he feared falling further behind Custer's plan. Historian Evan Connell describes Weir as a man driven by ambition, eager to prove himself in combat. His agitation at the morass underscored the growing unease among junior officers, who sensed the distant native village was no ordinary target. Weir's insistence on moving forward would soon force Benteen's hand, setting off a chain of events that altered the day's outcome. Lieutenant Godfrey, his kepi tilted and sweat staining his collar, rebuffed Weir's plea to confront Benteen. At 32, Godfrey was a reserved officer, respected but cautious, with a reputation for avoiding conflict with superiors. He knew Benteen's temper, honed over years of frontier service, could flare at any challenge. Godfrey's K Company, 38 strong, stood ready but weary, their carbines slung across their backs. His refusal to act, as noted in his own post-battle writings, stemmed from a pragmatic fear of Benteen's wrath and a belief that the captain would move when ready. This moment of inaction, though minor, highlighted the fractured cohesion among Custer's officers, a flaw that historian Stephen Ambrose argues contributed to the 7th Cavalry's unravelling against a disciplined native force. Weir, his face flushed with frustration, took matters into his own hands. Mounting his horse, he signalled D Company to follow, leading his 40 troopers down the trail without Benteen's approval. His bold move, witnessed by 80 other troopers, forced Benteen to act. With a curt order, Benteen rallied the remaining companies, H and K, totaling 80 men, and resumed the march, taking his place at the column's head. Weir's Defiance, while reckless, broke the inertia at the morass, as survivor accounts later confirmed. Historian John Gray notes that Weir's action, though insubordinate, aligned with the cavalry's ethos of initiative in crisis. Yet, it also exposed the lack of unified command, a weakness the Sioux and Cheyenne would exploit with devastating precision. Benteen, now leading with reins gripped tightly, paused a mile west to inspect a burning teepee, its buffalo hide smouldering and smoke curling into the sky. The teepee, likely abandoned by a Sioux or Cheyenne family, held a single body, possibly a warrior, as reported by trooper accounts. Benteen dismounted briefly, his boots crunching on dry grass, to examine the scene. The stop, lasting no more than 5 minutes, intrigued him, as it suggested the native village was closer than expected. Historian Robert Utley interprets this pause as evidence of Benteen's curiosity, perhaps a sign he underestimated the scale of the enemy ahead. The burning teepee, a lone marker of the gathering storm, hinted at the vast encampment of 7,000 native people, including 2,000 warriors, waiting down the valley. As Benteen's column pressed downstream along Reno Creek, the faint crackle of gunfire reached their ears, carried by the dry Montana wind. The sound, sporadic at first, grew steadier, signalling combat no more than 5 miles away. Benteen, riding at the head of his 120 men, tilted his head, his expression tightening. The gunfire, likely from Major Marcus Reno's engagement with the village, confirmed Custer's attack had begun. Soldier diaries, including those of Private John Martin, described the troops quickening their pace, carbines now unslung. Historian Gregory Michno estimates Reno's force of 150 faced over 1,000 warriors by 3 p.m., a mismatch that explains the urgent tempo of the shots. This distant echo of battle pushed Benteen toward a pivotal moment, where his next decisions would shape the fate of the 7th. Trooper Daniel Knipe, his horse lathered with sweat, galloped past Benteen's column, shouting for the captain to hurry. His message, possibly from Tom Custer, carried the weight of desperation, though its exact wording remains unclear in records. Knipe, a young private with 3 years in the cavalry, rode a sorrel mare, his carbine bouncing against his hip. His urgent plea, heard by at least 50 troopers, underscored the crisis unfolding ahead. Historian Stephen Ambrose suggests Knipe's ride was a spontaneous act, not an official dispatch, reflecting the chaos of Custer's fragmented command. As Benteen spurred his horse forward, the weight of Knipe's words settled over him, a grim reminder that the Sioux and Cheyenne, fighting for their homes, were no ordinary foe. Private John Martin, a 25-year-old Italian-born trooper, rode up to Captain Frederick Benteen, his carbine slung across his shoulder and his horse panting from a 3-mile gallop. On the 25th of June, 1876, he handed Benteen a scribbled note from Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, written by Adjutant William Cook. "Come on, big village, be quick. Bring packs." Martin, his face flushed under a dusty kepi, delivered the message under the scorching Montana sun, with Reno Creek shimmering in the distance. The note, preserved in Army records, was Custer's final order to Benteen, sent as the 7th Cavalry faced a village of 7,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, including 2,000 warriors. Historian Robert Utley calls this message a desperate plea, revealing Custer's realization of the enemy's overwhelming strength. Martin's arrival marked a turning point, thrusting Benteen into a decision that would shape the battle's outcome. Benteen, his eyebrows furrowed, unfolded the note and read it aloud to his company commanders, Captain Thomas Weir and Lieutenants William Godfrey and Winfield Edgerly. The officers, standing in a loose circle with their horses tethered nearby, offered no comment. Their silence, noted in Godfrey's later writings, reflected the uncertainty gripping the 120-man column. Benteen's force, consisting of companies D, H, and K, had marched 40 miles since dawn, and the men were weary, their canteens nearly empty. Historian Evan Connell suggests this mute response stemmed from distrust in Custer's leadership, as Benteen and Weir openly criticized his reckless tactics. The lack of counsel left Benteen alone to interpret the vague order, a moment that exposed the fractured unity among the 7th Cavalry's officers as they faced a formidable native coalition. Martin, still mounted, reported that Custer was 3 miles ahead, near the Little Bighorn River, and that Major Marcus Reno had begun attacking the native village. His words, relayed to Benteen's 120 troopers, stirred a mix of urgency and dread. Reno's force, numbering 150 men, was engaged with an enemy that survivor accounts estimate at 1,000 warriors by 3 p.m. Benteen, pacing beside his horse, weighed the note's demands. Speed and supplies. The village's size, housing 7,000 people across a 3-mile stretch, was unprecedented, as later confirmed by Crow Scout reports. Historian Stephen Ambrose argues that Martin's update forced Benteen to confront the reality of Custer's miscalculation, as the 7th Cavalry, totaling 600 men, was vastly outnumbered. This news pushed Benteen toward a critical choice, with the gunfire now audible in the distance. Benteen, his voice firm, declared to his officers, "If I am to be of service, I cannot wait for the packs." His decision prioritized speed over supplies, a choice driven by the note's urgency and the growing sound of battle. The pack train, carrying 24,000 rounds of ammunition, was a mile behind, moving at a mere 2 miles per hour, as Army logistics records show. Benteen, a pragmatist with 15 years of frontier experience, knew that waiting could strand Custer's and Reno's forces, already engaged with a force 10 times their size. Historian John Gray praises this as a sound tactical move, though critics like Robert Utley argue it left the 7th vulnerable without immediate access to ammunition. Benteen's call, made under pressure, reflected his focus on reaching the fight, even as the Sioux and Cheyenne fought fiercely to protect their families. Benteen turned to Private Martin, ordering him to ride back to Captain Thomas McDougall and urge the pack train to hurry. Martin, his horse now lathered with sweat, nodded and galloped east, covering the mile to the train's 140 mules. McDougall's command, with 20 troopers guarding the supplies, struggled over rocky terrain, their progress hampered by the mules' stubborn pace. The train carried not only ammunition but also medical supplies and rations, critical for a campaign expected to last days. Historian Gregory Micknow notes that the pack train's delay, averaging 90 minutes behind Benteen's column, was a logistical failure that compounded the 7th challenges. Martin's mission, though urgent, underscored the Army's underestimation of the native forces, who were already overwhelming Reno's men in the valley. At a fork in the trail, where Custer and Reno had split hours earlier, Benteen halted his 120-man column, muttering about the horns of a dilemma. The fork, a dusty junction near Reno Creek, marked a critical decision point. To the right, Custer's trail led north toward the bluffs. To the left, Reno's path descended to the Little Bighorn River. Benteen, his reins loose in one hand, faced a choice: follow Custer or seek Reno, whose gunfire echoed closer. Army reports indicate Custer's force of 210 men was now 3 miles away, while Reno's 150 were less than a mile downstream. Historian Robert Utley describes this pause as Benteen's attempt to reconcile Custer's orders with the reality of the battlefield. The dilemma, rooted in poor communication, left Benteen navigating a crisis that the Sioux and Cheyenne had turned to their advantage. After a brief discussion with his officers, Benteen split his force. He led part of the column, about 60 men, left toward the river, while the rest, under Weir, veered right toward the bluffs. The decision, made as gunfire grew louder, aimed to locate Reno's embattled force. Benteen's men, riding in a tight formation, kicked up dust as they descended the slope, their carbines at the ready. Historian John Gray argues that this split was a calculated risk, allowing Benteen to cover both possible routes to the fight. The maneuver, however, stretched his small command thin, with only 120 troopers against a native force that outnumbered them tenfold. The move reflected Benteen's adaptability, but also the 7th's vulnerability against a unified Sioux and Cheyenne resistance. From the bluffs overlooking the Little Bighorn, Benteen's men caught sight of chaos in the valley below. Smoke and dust rose where Reno's 150 troopers clashed with hundreds of warriors, their war cries piercing the air. Benteen, squinting through the haze, could not discern whether the figures were Custer's men, Reno's, or native fighters. The village, stretching 3 miles along the river, housed 7,000 people, a scale that stunned the cavalry, as later noted by Crow scouts. Historian Stephen Ambrose estimates that by 3:30 p.m., Reno's force had suffered 40 casualties, nearly a third of his command. Benteen's uncertainty, compounded by Custer's vague orders, highlighted the Army's failure to grasp the native coalition's strength, fighting to defend their homes and way of life. Benteen spurred his horse forward, his saber rattling at his side, and galloped toward the sound of battle. His 120 men followed, their hooves thundering across the dry grass. As they crested a rise, they met Major Marcus Reno, his hat gone and his face pale with panic. Reno, commanding 150 men hours earlier, stood on a bluff, his uniform torn and his revolver in hand, shouting for Benteen to halt and help. Survivor accounts describe Reno as shaken, his voice cracking as he begged for support. Historian Evan Connell portrays Reno as overwhelmed, his leadership crumbling under the weight of the native onslaught. Benteen's arrival, at roughly 4 p.m., marked a critical juncture where his response would determine whether the 7th could rally or collapse. Reno, his voice hoarse, admitted to Benteen that he had lost half his 150 men, with 75 killed or wounded in the valley fight. The Sioux and Cheyenne, numbering 1,000 to 1,500 warriors, according to historian Stephen Ambrose, had routed Reno's command in under 30 minutes, driving them to the bluffs. Reno's troopers, now reduced to 75 effectives, were scattered and demoralized, their horses panicked and their ammunition low. Benteen, dismounting to face Reno, absorbed the grim reality. The village's defenders, fighting with unmatched ferocity, had shattered the 7th's initial attack. Ambrose notes that the native warriors, armed with repeating rifles and bows, held a tactical edge, exploiting the cavalry's exposed position. Reno's collapse set the stage for Benteen's next move, as the battle's tide turned decisively against the 7th. Captain Frederick Benteen, his face grim under a dusty kepi, urged Major Marcus Reno to join forces with Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, whose fate remained unknown. On the 25th of June, 1876, atop a bluff overlooking the Little Bighorn, Benteen argued that speed was critical to support Custer's 210 men, last seen 3 miles north. Reno, the senior officer with 17 years of service, overruled him, his voice strained as he ordered the combined force of 270 men to halt and await the pack train's ammunition. Reno's decision, rooted in his command's depleted state, with only 75 of his original 150 troopers still combat-ready, prioritized resupply over pursuit. Historian Robert Utley notes that Reno's order, while cautious, delayed any chance of aiding Custer, leaving Benteen to grapple with the Sioux and Cheyenne's relentless pressure as their 500 warriors dominated the valley below. Benteen, now subordinate to Reno, complied with a soldier's discipline, though his tight jaw betrayed frustration. He turned to Captain Thomas Weir and Lieutenant William Godfrey, ordering their companies D and K, totaling 78 men, to form skirmish lines along the bluff's edge. The troopers, their blue uniforms stained with sweat, spread out in pairs, carbines ready, facing the river where smoke rose from the native village. This defensive posture, standard for cavalry under attack, aimed to protect the 270 survivors from further assaults. Historian John Gray praises Benteen's quick organization, noting that his 120-man battalion, still intact, bolstered Reno's shattered force. Yet, the decision to dig in, as the Sioux and Cheyenne pressed their advantage, underscored the 7th Cavalry's precarious position, far from the pack train's 24,000 rounds of ammunition. From the valley below, stragglers from Reno's routed command staggered up the bluffs, their uniforms torn and faces bloodied. Of Reno's 150 men, only 75 reached safety, with 40 dead and 35 wounded, as survivor accounts confirm. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, their ponies galloping in tight formations, pursued the fleeing troopers, cutting down those too slow to escape. Soldier diaries describe the chaos. Men stumbled over sagebrush, horses reared in panic, and arrows hissed through the air. Historian Stephen Ambrose estimates that 500 warriors engaged Reno's force, their speed and coordination overwhelming the cavalry's linear tactics. The survivors' arrival, ragged and demoralized, painted a stark picture of the native coalition's strength, fighting to protect a village of 7,000, including women and children. As Reno's men regrouped, the bulk of the native warriors, their faces painted red and black, shifted downstream, their war cries fading into the distance. A smaller group, perhaps 200, remained behind, methodically dispatching wounded soldiers left in the valley. Survivor testimonies, including those of Lieutenant Charles Varnum, describe warriors moving among the fallen, stripping uniforms and taking scalps, a practice rooted in cultural traditions of honoring victory. Historian Gregory Michno notes that these actions, though horrific to the cavalry, were standard in plains warfare, reflecting the Sioux and Cheyenne's resolve to defend their homeland. The sight of this aftermath, visible from the bluffs, chilled the 270 troopers, who now faced the reality of their isolation, with Custer's fate unknown and their own survival uncertain. Around 4:30 p.m., heavy gunfire, possibly volleys, echoed from downstream, where Custer's 210 men were believed to be engaged. Lieutenant Varnum, his binoculars trembling in his hands, turned to Lieutenant George Wallace and exclaimed, "Jesus Christ, hear that!" The sound, sharp and sustained, carried over 3 miles, signaling a desperate fight. Varnum, a 29-year-old officer with 5 years in the cavalry, stood among the 75 survivors of Reno's command, his uniform dusty but intact. Army reports suggest Custer's force faced 1,000 warriors by 4 p.m., a clash that produced the volleys heard on the bluffs. Historian Evan Connell argues that these shots were Custer's last stand, a frantic effort against an encirclement that would claim 210 lives. The chilling sound galvanized some officers, but failed to spur action, as Reno's command remained rooted in place. Despite the gunfire, Reno's 6 companies, totaling 270 men, did not march to Custer's aid. 3 companies, Reno's A, G, and M, were battered, with only 75 effectives left, while Benteen's D, H, and K remained largely intact at 120. The decision to stay put, driven by Reno's orders, drew sharp criticism from historian Evan Connell, who calls it a failure of leadership that doomed Custer's battalion. Reno's men, low on ammunition with an average of 20 rounds per trooper, faced a village of 2,000 warriors, as Crow Scout reports later confirmed. The choice to hold the bluffs, while tactically defensible, reflected Reno's shaken state and the 7th's underestimation of the Sioux and Cheyenne, whose coordinated attacks had already shattered one wing of the regiment. Reno, his leadership faltering, failed to organize a cohesive defense or send scouts to assess the situation. His 270 men, spread across the bluffs, lacked entrenchments, with no natural cover beyond low shrubs. Reno, pacing with his revolver in hand, issued no orders for fortifications or reconnaissance, leaving his command exposed. Historian Robert Utley criticizes this inaction, noting that basic cavalry protocol called for pickets and patrols to detect enemy movements. The absence of such measures, as 1,500 warriors maneuvered nearby, heightened the risk to the 7th survivors. Reno's failure to act, contrasted with the Sioux and Cheyenne's disciplined tactics, underscored the disparity in preparedness, as the natives fought with a unity born of defending their families. In a bewildering move, Reno, his face pale, drew his revolver and led a dozen troopers down the bluff to search for the body of his aide, Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson. The group, moving through tall grass, spent 30 minutes recovering Hodgson's remains and personal items, including a watch and letters. Reno's absence left his 270 men leaderless, with no officer designated to assume command. Historian Stephen Ambrose calls this an unforgivable lapse, arguing that Reno's personal mission abandoned his duty at a critical moment. The troopers, watching their commander descend into the valley where 200 warriors still roamed, grew anxious, their trust in Reno eroding. The episode highlighted Reno's emotional collapse, even as the Sioux and Cheyenne maintained relentless pressure. Upon returning, Reno, his uniform stained with dirt, appointed Lieutenant Luther Hare as his adjutant, ordering him to ride back and hasten the pack train, still a mile away. Hare, a 25-year-old Texan with a reputation for boldness, mounted his horse and galloped east, his carbine slung. The pack train, with 140 mules carrying 24,000 rounds, was critical to sustaining the 270-man defense, as each trooper had fired an average of 30 rounds in the valley fight. Historian John Gray notes that Hare's mission, though urgent, could have been ordered earlier, sparing the command its precarious weight. Hare's ride, under the watchful eyes of native scouts, underscored the 7th's desperation as the Sioux and Cheyenne prepared to renew their assault. Captain Thomas Weir, his spurs glinting, grew restless as the downstream gunfire faded, a sign that Custer's fight was waning. Around 5 p.m., he turned to Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly and First Sergeant Michael Martin, asking if they would advance without orders to aid Custer. Weir's D Company, 40 strong, stood ready, their horses tethered nearby. Edgerly, 30, and Martin, a 35-year-old Irish veteran, agreed, their faces set with determination. Historian Gregory Micknow describes Weir's impatience as a mix of courage and frustration, driven by his disdain for Reno's inaction. The fading volleys, now sporadic, suggested Custer's 210 men were overwhelmed, as later confirmed by native accounts of 1,000 warriors encircling Last Stand Hill. Weir's resolve to act, despite the risks, set the stage for a bold but fateful move. Captain Thomas Weir, his face flushed with defiance, clashed bitterly with Major Marcus Reno on the bluffs overlooking the Little Bighorn on the 25th of June, 1876. Weir, a 35-year-old officer known for his brashness, despised Reno, a mutual animosity rooted in years of personal slights within the 7th Cavalry. After a heated exchange, with Reno refusing to advance toward the fading gunfire 3 miles north, Weir mounted his horse, his coat flapping, and rode alone toward the sound of battle. His solitary charge, witnessed by 270 troopers, was a bold rebuke of Reno's caution. Historian Evan Connell describes Weir's act as driven by a mix of courage and recklessness, spurred by his belief that Custer's 210 men needed immediate aid. As Weir galloped north, he left behind a fractured command, facing a village of 7,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, whose warriors had already crushed Reno's force. At a high ridge, later named Weir Point, Weir halted and deployed his D Company, 40 troopers strong, into a skirmish line. Peering across the rolling hills, he pointed toward distant figures, declaring them Custer's men. Sergeant James Flanagan, a 40-year-old Irish veteran, raised his binoculars and corrected him. Those are Indians. The figures, numbering at least 500 warriors, according to survivor accounts, moved with purpose, their lances and rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun. Weir's mistake, as historian Robert Utley notes, stemmed from wishful thinking, as Custer's battalion was already encircled 3 miles away, fighting for survival against 1,000 Sioux and Cheyenne. The misidentification at Weir Point, roughly 5 p.m., exposed D Company to immediate danger, highlighting the 7th's desperate situation as the native coalition tightened its grip. Captain Frederick Benteen, seeing Weir's advance, assumed Reno had ordered a general movement. He rallied companies H, K, and M, totaling 120 men, and led them north, their hooves thundering across the dry grass. Benteen, his saber at his side, rode at the head, his 15 years of cavalry experience guiding his swift response. The column, stretching 200 yards, moved at a trot, covering the mile to Weir Point in under 10 minutes, as timed by Lieutenant Godfrey's later report. Historian John Gray credits Benteen's initiative, noting that his arrival bolstered Weir's exposed position. Yet, the advance, made without clear orders, reflected the 7th Thie's disjointed command structure, a flaw that the Sioux and Cheyenne exploited with their coordinated assaults as their 500 warriors dominated the battlefield. Captain Thomas McDougall, his face weathered from the Montana sun, arrived with the pack train at the bluffs around 5:15 p.m., bringing 140 mules laden with 24 rounds of .45 -70 ammunition. McDougall's 20 troopers, dusty and exhausted, formed a skirmish line to secure the position, a task Reno had neglected. The pack train, delayed by nearly 90 minutes due to the mules' slow pace of 2 miles per hour, carried enough ammunition to sustain the 270-man command for days, as Army logistics records confirm. Historian Gregory Mickno praises McDougall's timely arrival, which provided the means to fortify the defense. Reno's failure to organize this earlier, Mickno argues, left his men critically short of rounds, with troopers averaging 20 cartridges each after the Valley fight. The pack train's arrival marked a turning point, but the Sioux and Cheyenne's relentless pressure loomed large. Reno, standing on the bluffs with his revolver drawn, ordered a trumpeter to sound the halt, signaling Benteen to stop his advance. Benteen, now at Weir Point with 120 men, ignored the call, his focus fixed on deploying his companies to support Weir's 40 troopers. He positioned companies H, K, and M in skirmish lines, their carbines aimed at the approaching warriors. The trumpet's notes, heard by 270 men, went unheeded, a sign of Benteen's growing authority over Reno's faltering command. Historian Stephen Ambrose notes that Benteen's defiance, while insubordinate, was pragmatic, as Weir Point offered a vantage to assess the battle. The decision to stay, however, placed 160 men in a vulnerable position as the Sioux and Cheyenne, fighting to protect their families, prepared to strike. From Weir Point, Benteen's men saw hundreds of native warriors, their lances gleaming and ponies galloping, advancing toward their position. Survivor accounts estimate 600 to 800 warriors, a force that dwarfed the 160 troopers on the ridge. Benteen, scanning the terrain, realized Weir Point's open slopes offered little cover, with no natural barriers to shield his men. He dismounted, his boots crunching on gravel, and conferred with his officers, concluding the position was indefensible against such numbers. Historian Robert Utley argues that Benteen's assessment was sound, as the 7th 600-man regiment had already lost 262 men by day's end, per Army casualty reports. The sight of the native advance, disciplined and relentless, forced Benteen to reconsider his strategy, as the Sioux and Cheyenne fought with unmatched resolve. Benteen, his voice steady, rode back to Reno on the bluffs and convinced him to withdraw the entire 270-man command to their original position, a mile south. Reno, his face pale and uniform disheveled, agreed, ordering the retreat. The decision left Weir's D Company and Captain Samuel French's M Company, totaling 80 men, isolated at Weir Point, unaware of the pullback. Historian Evan Connell criticizes this miscommunication, noting that Reno's failure to coordinate left 2 companies exposed to 600 warriors. The retreat, executed around 5:30 p.m., prioritized consolidating the 7th survivors but abandoned Weir's men to a perilous fate. As the Sioux and Cheyenne closed in, their war cries echoing across the hills. Captain French and Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly, realizing they were cut off, ordered their 80 men to mount and flee south, pursued by 200 warriors on swift ponies. The retreat, chaotic and desperate, saw troopers galloping through sagebrush, their carbines useless at full speed. Private Vincent Charlie, a 30-year-old Swiss immigrant, was shot from his horse, his body later found with a broken guidon shaft driven through his throat, as reported by Lieutenant Godfrey. Historian Gregory Micknow calls this pursuit a testament to the native warriors' ferocity, as they capitalized on the 7th's disarray. The loss of Charlie, one of 262 fatalities that day, underscored the cost of Reno's and Benteen's retreat, leaving men to face the Sioux and Cheyenne's unrelenting assault. Lieutenant William Godfrey, his moustache twitching with resolve, took charge of Company K, 38 men strong, to form a rearguard as the retreat faltered. Godfrey, 32, and often criticized as unmilitary, organized his troopers into 2 platoons, alternating fire and withdrawal under heavy pressure from 200 warriors. Lieutenant Luther Hare, a bold 25-year-old Texan, assisted, shouting orders to keep the men steady. The rearguard, covering 300 yards, fired 400 rounds in 10 minutes, per Godfrey's report, slowing the native advance. Historian John Gray lauds Godfrey's discipline, noting that his actions at Weir Point mirrored his success in the 1873 Yellowstone campaign. Against the Sioux and Cheyenne's superior numbers, Godfrey's stand bought critical time for the 7th survivors to regroup. Godfrey's 30 effectives, bolstered by Hare's leadership, reached the bluffs without a single casualty, a feat remarkable given the 200 warriors in pursuit. The men, their faces blackened by gunpowder, sprinted the final 100 yards to safety, collapsing behind makeshift barriers of saddles and packs. Army records confirm Company K's success, with all 38 men accounted for, a rare bright spot in a day that cost the 7th 262 lives. Historian John Gray credits Godfrey and Hare's coordination, arguing that their rearguard action prevented a total rout. The Sioux and Cheyenne, though dominant, paused their assault as dusk fell, allowing the 270 survivors to brace for the next onslaught, their resolve tested but unbroken. On the bluffs above the Little Bighorn, the 270 survivors of the 7th Cavalry scrambled to fortify their position as dusk approached on the 25th of June, 1876. With no natural cover, troopers stacked saddles, grain bags, and the carcasses of dead horses to form crude barricades. Only 3 spades were available for the entire command, forcing men to dig shallow trenches with tin cups and bayonets. Major Marcus Reno's force, now reduced to 75 effectives from 150, joined Captain Frederick Benteen's 120-man battalion in this desperate effort. Historian Robert Utley estimates that the defensive perimeter, a rough oval 200 yards long, sheltered 270 men against a Sioux and Cheyenne force of 1,500 warriors. The makeshift defenses, built under the threat of renewed attacks, reflected the 7th's dire situation, as the native coalition, fighting to protect their village of 7,000, held the battlefield's momentum. By sunset on the 25th of June, the toll of the day's fighting was stark. 12 troopers lay dead, and 21 were wounded, according to survivor accounts compiled by Army investigators. The casualties, concentrated among Reno's companies A, G, and M, included men shot by arrows or bullets during the valley retreat and the skirmishes at Weir Point. Wounded soldiers, their uniforms bloodied, were tended by a single surgeon, Dr. James Porter, who worked with limited supplies under a canvas tarp. Historian Gregory Micknow notes that the 33 total casualties, representing 12% of the 270-man command, crippled Reno's ability to mount an offensive. The grim tally, visible in the still forms behind the barricades, underscored the Sioux and Cheyenne's dominance, as their warriors prepared for the next assault. During the night, all companies except Benteen's H Company labored to strengthen their defenses, digging rifle pits with their scant tools. The pits, averaging 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, offered minimal protection but boosted morale among the 270 troopers who worked by moonlight. Benteen's H Company, 40 strong, stood guard, their carbines trained on the dark valley where campfires glowed in the native village. Soldier diaries, including those of Lieutenant William Godfrey, describe the men's exhaustion after marching 40 miles and fighting for hours, yet their efforts yielded 50 rifle pits by dawn. Historian John Gray argues that these fortifications, though rudimentary, were critical, as the Sioux and Cheyenne resumed attacks with 1,000 warriors at first light. The night's work, driven by survival, showcased the 7th's resilience against a formidable foe. At dawn on the 26th of June, the Sioux and Cheyenne renewed their assault, their war cries piercing the morning air as 1,000 warriors advanced on the bluffs. They fired from cover, using repeating rifles and bows, while others circled on ponies, probing for weaknesses. Around noon, warriors set fire to the grass along the Little Bighorn, a tactic that cloaked their movements in thick smoke, as documented by ethnographer George Bird Grinnell in his studies of plains warfare. The 270 troopers, low on ammunition with an average of 15 rounds per man, returned fire sparingly, their Springfield carbines outranged by native Winchesters. Historian Stephen Ambrose estimates that the day's fighting wounded 30 more soldiers, bringing the two-day total to 63. The burning grass, a haunting symbol of native ingenuity, kept the 7th pinned down, unable to counter the warriors' relentless pressure. By late afternoon on the 26th of June, the native villages began moving upstream, their travois laden with belongings, stretching for miles along the Little Bighorn. The 270 troopers, peering from their rifle pits, watched in awe as 7,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, including 2,000 warriors, relocated their camp. Women and children, driving herds of 10,000 ponies, moved with practiced efficiency, as noted in Crow Scout reports. Historian Evan Connell describes this migration as a strategic withdrawal, prompted by reports of approaching army reinforcements. The sight, both majestic and sobering, signaled a pause in the fighting, but the 7th survivors, with 63 casualties and dwindling supplies, remained on edge, unaware of the native coalition's next move. That night, the 7th Cavalry, now 250 strong after losses, accessed water from the Little Bighorn, their first since the previous day. Troopers, parched after 36 hours of fighting, filled canteens under guard, while others linked up with stragglers like Lieutenant Charles DeRudio, who had hidden in the valley's timber since Reno's retreat. DeRudio, a 44-year-old Italian veteran, emerged with 3 others, their uniforms tattered but alive, as recorded in army dispatches. The reunions, tempered by the loss of 262 comrades, bolstered the command's morale. Historian John Gray notes that this respite, though brief, allowed the 7th to reorganize. As the Sioux and Cheyenne's departure left the bluffs eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the 25th of June. General Alfred Terry's column, 400 strong, crossed the Yellowstone River on the 24th of June, aiming to rendezvous with the 7th Cavalry. Comprising 4 cavalry companies, 5 infantry units, and a Gatling gun detachment, the force moved slowly, hampered by a guide unfamiliar with the terrain. Covering only 20 miles in 2 days, per army logs, Terry's men halted a mile from the Little Bighorn on the 26th of June, unaware of the disaster unfolding. Historian Robert Utley criticizes Terry's sluggish pace, noting that his 400 men could have reinforced Custer's 600, potentially altering the battle's outcome. The delay, compounded by the Sioux and Cheyenne's control of the region, left Terry's force out of reach as the 7th fought for survival. On the 27th of June, Terry's scouts encountered 3 of Custer's Crow allies White Man Runs Him, Harry Moccasin, and Goes Ahead, who reported the near annihilation of the 7th 600-man regiment. The scouts, their faces grim, described Custer's 210-man battalion wiped out, with only Reno's 270 survivors holding the bluffs. Terry, a 49-year-old general with 20 years of service, dismissed the news, stating, "I find it impossible to believe so fine a regiment could meet such a catastrophe." His skepticism, recorded in his official report, reflected the Army's overconfidence, underestimating the 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. The Crow Scouts' warning, though accurate, fell on deaf ears, delaying Terry's grasp of the tragedy that claimed 262 lives. As Terry's column advanced on the 27th of June, his men stumbled upon grim relics, abandoned teepees with dead warriors, the severed heads of 3 soldiers, and personal items like Lieutenant Samuel Sturgis's underwear and Captain George Yates's gloves. These findings, scattered across a mile of the Little Bighorn Valley, confirmed the Crow Scouts' account. Lieutenant John Bradley, leading Terry's scouts, reported 197 bodies on Custer's battlefield per Army records, a toll that shocked the 400-man column. Historian Stephen Ambrose calls these discoveries a macabre testament to the Sioux and Cheyenne's victory, as their warriors left behind evidence of a rout. The relics, stark and personal, forced Terry to confront the 7th's devastation, a reality the native coalition had imposed with devastating precision. Captain Benteen, ordered by Terry to investigate Custer's fate, rode to Last Stand Hill on the 27th of June, his face set with grim resolve. A trooper, pointing to a body stripped of clothing, beckoned Benteen to dismount. Kneeling beside the corpse, Benteen recognized Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, his blonde hair matted with blood, shot through the head and chest. "By God, that is him," Benteen muttered, his voice low, before mounting his horse and riding off. The sight, witnessed by 20 troopers, confirmed the loss of 210 men per Army casualty lists. Historian Evan Connell notes Benteen's curt reaction, suggesting his disdain for Custer tempered any grief. The moment, heavy with finality, marked the end of Custer's command, while the Sioux and Cheyenne's triumph echoed as a fleeting victory for a people defending their way of life. As Captain Benteen rode away from Custer's body on Last Stand Hill, the weight of the 25th of June, 1876, settled over the 270 survivors of the 7th Cavalry. The Sioux and Cheyenne, their villages now moving beyond the Little Bighorn, had secured a victory that claimed 262 lives, a testament to their resolve to protect their people and lands. Benteen's grit and Reno's hesitation shaped a desperate defense, preserving a remnant of the regiment against overwhelming odds. Historian Stephen Ambrose calls this clash a fleeting triumph for the native nations, whose unity and courage outmatched the fractured 7th. The scars of that day linger, a somber reminder of a people's stand for survival, etched into the Montana hills.